Too Much Information is a production of iHeart.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known fascinating facts and figures behind your favorite TV shows, movies, music, and more. We're your two paranormal investigators of pretty interesting trivia, your poltergeists of probing, not that way. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh.
And Jordan, today we're talking about one of the defining haunted house stories of the 20th century, the film that launched 1,000 ripoffs, literally, and the book that inspired it. And, I don't know, man. We've got like 21 pages. We should not run long on this intro.
That's very true. Yeah, this is maybe one of the most insanity-inducing episodes we've ever done. I mean, the Titanic three-parter almost killed me. You got away fairly unscathed, but this one nearly took us both down because you got the murder, you've got the supposed real-life haunting, you got the book, you got the movie, you got the gazillion sequels, and you've got just the flurry of lawsuits. It is a wild ride. This is really, I think, one of the craziest episodes we've ever done. How many episodes have we done that have a haunted pig? It's kind of shocking that we've made it to like episode 160 without a haunted pig.
I know. I feel remiss about that. But Jordan, where do you get off on the old Amityville Express?
You know, I mostly come at this through the real life murder, which we'll talk about, the DeFeo murder, and the, I guess I have to say, alleged haunting that followed in the aftermath.
You don't.
Well, okay.
There's that Jimmy Carr bit that he's like, Joker's like, there's actually a rather simple way to tell if your house is haunted. It isn't.
I love Jimmy Carr. Yeah. I mean, okay, so the phenomenon, shall we say, of the real life house. The book, I'm sure I read at some point. The movie I probably saw 20 years ago. I haven't seen since. Once it starts getting into the pop culture realm, I tend to taper off a little bit. But yeah, the murder and all the investigations done on the house out on in Amityville is kind of what interests me. What are your thoughts on the movie?
I mean, it has been a while since I've seen it, but I don't remember it being particularly good.
Yeah.
I think what drew me to writing this, and the reason I did 21 pages on it, was it is one of the most repellent cases of American and or human nature that I think I've ever, like, as angry as I was at Jerry Springer by the time we got done with that episode, I am angrier by this, but I could not look away.
Yeah, I mean, you were really, it's funny. For me, I found this to be, murder aside, which is a really sad qualifier, a sort of just uniquely American brand of hucksterism, you know, like faking a haunted house, essentially.
Yeah, to get out of your mortgage.
But this really offended you.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's a combination of how much I hate Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Famous pseudo-psychic investigators that
bullshit
are
artists.
Okay, sure, con artists.
And if you believe the allegation, human monsters. So yeah, I really hate them, and I hate George Lutz. It's cosmically hilarious. His name rhymes with putz.
Yes,
because like the guy
George Lutz, by the way, is the guy who moved into the Amityville horror house after the murders,
the architect
and
of
claimed
this whole thing.
Yeah, claimed that the house was haunted and sort of shining him, like took over him and his family, nearly killed them all, and they fled in the dead of night after only living there for 4 weeks.
Yeah, and then spent like the rest of his life,
half century,
jealously guarding, literally like a little chihuahua, just like barking at people who came close to this. Had no other skills. I hate it. It's so gross, and like, you know, we're perpetuating the cycle, but like, I think
it's so fascinating though.
The fact that 6 people were like shot to death in their home, and then this guy moved in before the trial was even done and was like with a scam in place.
Yeah,
is utterly repellent. And then the cast of the lawyer, Weber, who we'll get into, like, also repellent. And just like,
should we be throwing more allegedlys in here? Because I think he's still alive.
He's got to be near death, right? Also, like, that's, unless it's defamatory, which that's not like libel. It's my opinion.
Okay.
I don't think he could argue that I'm damaging his reputation more than he has by calling him an opportunistic scumbag.
Well, okay, let me ask you this. Do you think, I mean, I'm sure that there are people out there that genuinely believe that this house is
Yes.
overtaken by
Yes.
supernatural phenomena?
Yeah. There are people out there. Not that I don't believe in some form of life after death. Like, as we discussed, I don't actually know how much of it you cut into the episode, but like, I believe that based on, the principles of thermonuclear physics, like matter cannot be created or destroyed, just changes forms. Like, I do believe, whatever our brain or soul is just like electrical impulses. So that probably just goes into the world and comes back in weird ways. But
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, we talked about that during the Sixth Sense episode.
right, yes. So yeah, I don't know, man. I just this whole cottage industry of like ghost hunting and paranormal investigation. I mean, I respect people who are more about it being like drawing some kind of line and being like hard, this is bullshit, versus people who are just like, well, I'm just open to everything. Like, as we'll discuss, one of the debunkers of the Amityville story is a guy who believes vampires are real.
And living in Manhattan.
Yeah, real and living in not in Brooklyn. Curious.
No, but Queens, the Bronx, and Manhattan. Yes.
It was just funny because Eddie Murphy made a movie about it. Yeah, I don't know, man. The whole thing is really interesting to me. It's like it's a weird phenomenon. I think it attracts weird people, and I think it is ultimately about like money and clout.
And we are some of the weird people following in their lineage.
Anyway, from the aforementioned haunted pig demon named Jodie, to the dedication of the con artist at the center of all of this, to the record-setting triumph of the film, here's everything you didn't know about the Amityville Horror. Horror. I'm gonna have to keeping an eye on my regional accent there. The Amityville Horror.
Amityville Horror.
Her name was Jodie. Anyway, the basis for this book, film, and its descendants is the case of the aforementioned Lutz family, patriarch George, matriarch Kathy, during the 28 days that they spent in their Amityville, Long Island home at 112 Ocean Avenue in December of 1975. 13 months before the family moved in, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered 6 members of his family in the house, both parents and 4 siblings. Claiming that this had an effect on the house and paranormal circumstances arose from it, the Lutzes vacated the home in, as mentioned, 28 days.
In the dead of night.
And yes, in the dead of night, leaving their things to be auctioned off later.
Never to set foot in that, possibly on that coast again.
Maybe. I'm sure.
They moved to California soon after.
Yeah, but with the volume of lawsuits, I'm sure he was traveling back and forth. He had to be in Brooklyn at one point, at least. Anyway, we're putting the disgusting scam artist ahead of the tragedy here, which is that Thursday, November 13th, 1974, at an oft-discussed window between 2:45 and 3:15 a.m., Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his mother, father, and 4 younger siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle in the Amityville home with the front yard sign that read High Hopes, where the family had been living for 9 years. He then showered, trimmed his beard, dressed in his jeans and work boots, before wrapping up his bloodied clothing and the rifle in a pillowcase. Then he drove from Amityville to Brooklyn, where he threw the pillowcase into a storm drain and drove back to Long Island to report for work at his grandfather's Buick dealership at 6 a.m. I'm trying not to get into the true crime podcast cadence, but I could also, refer some. I could layer some sinister ambient music in here.
Ooh.
We think that'll juice the numbers.
Ooh.
DeFeo Jr., heretofore just DeFeo, repeatedly called his parents' house from work before leaving around 12 p.m. On his way back to Amityville, he met up with his girlfriend Shelby, calling his house from her apartment to demonstrate that no one was answering, and then met up with his friend Bobby, whom he explained the situation to, opining that there's something going on over there. A few hours later, he went out to a local bar, Henry's, where Bobby joined him. DeFeo continually brought up the situation with the house and told Bobby that he was going to drive over and break in through a window. He left and returned shortly after, saying, "Someone shot my mother and father."
It really creeps me out all of the ways that he laid an alibi, calling the house from multiple different places. There's a record of him calling, doing it with witnesses there, going to the bar and be like, yeah, it's the weirdest thing. I don't know what's going on with my family. Nobody's answering. Like that. I mean, they talk about later, maybe he almost certainly wasn't being possessed by the devil. He just had antisocial personality disorder. That sounds like what it was. That's really scary. That's psychopathic behavior. Obviously, he just shot his entire family. I don't know why I feel the need to make that point, but really creeps me out. That part, it's all the like premeditation that creeps me out about this. This is where it gets a little weird, though, and I'm curious about your take on this. All of the victims were found face down in their beds, apparently undisturbed. There was a lack of defensive wounds. You would think that the sound of these rifle blasts in the house would have woken up some of the later victims. The rifle didn't have any kind of silencer on it or anything, but it doesn't seem like any of them were disturbed. But there are theories that the bodies were moved post-mortem, and so maybe that was why they were all in the face-down position on all their individual beds. But according to the official autopsy, they weren't moved. There were also no traces of drugs in the victims' bodies, because that would have been the other theory of that he drugged them or something before killing them. Also interesting that none of the neighbors, because there were houses nearby, reported hearing the dozen-ish rifle blasts in the middle of the night. So this gave rise to rumors of the house's, evil satanic energy. It put up some kind of a weird
a baffler,
a cone of silence, an evil cone of silence during the time of the murders. I don't know. That is interesting, though. I do find it strange that officially the bodies were not moved, which means that they were all just, face down in bed, and nobody seemed to hear anything in the house, or any of the neighbors heard anything either.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big house built in 1923. I don't know how much sound would have escaped it. Is Amityville rural? Is it like a hamlet?
I don't know. I think it's like from what little I've seen of it, it just kind of looks like a New England town to me, a little seaside village.
Okay. Well, that's all fine. About 15 hours after the murders had taken place, police had been notified, and by 7 p.m., police and neighborhood rubberneckers had descended on the house. Suffolk County Detective Gaspar Randazzo, incredible name. This story has a lot of Italian-American shame. He was the first to question DeFeo, the massacre's sole survivor, who volunteered one Louis Fellini, a notorious mafia hitman, as the likely culprit, based on an argument Fellini had had with Ronald DeFeo Sr. years prior.
That's his dad. And it's also worth noting that the DeFeo grandfather was involved with the Genovese crime family. We'll touch more on that in a moment. But it wasn't inconceivable that this could have been a mob hit, given their ties.
Sure.
I mean,
in the moment to the detectives.
Yeah.
Based on his premise of mafia involvement, police took DeFeo into protective custody, and he gave them a statement at the station and went to sleep on a cot in the back. Meanwhile, another detective at the Amityville house uncovered a pair of cardboard boxes in DeFeo's room, both with labels describing their recently used contents, Marlin rifles, a 22 and a 35. The detective didn't know that a 35 caliber Marlin had been the murder weapon, but took the boxes anyway. And at 8:45 a.m., Detective George Harrison,
not that one,
and not the first time this will happen in this episode, shook DeFeo awake. "Did you find Fellini yet?" DeFeo asked.
Deny till you die.
But George Harrison, not that one, was not there with any such news. He was there to read DeFeo his rights. DeFeo protested that he'd been trying to be cooperative all along, and went so far, doltishly, as to waive his right to counsel, in an attempt to prove he was an innocent witness with nothing to hide. A fresh set of detectives arrived and grilled DeFeo about the inconsistencies in his statement, which DeFeo began to alter as the interrogation went on. After a while, they got him to confess. "It all started so fast," he said. "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast."
This is known in legal circles as the Pringles defense.
Can you put the Taco Bell sound in there? I didn't have it pulled up.
Oh, people died. And I still couldn't.
Oh,
Six
in the
people.
night, in their beds.
6 people,
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, this all was traced back to Ron DeFeo's dad, Ron DeFeo Sr. He was apparently a demanding, raging father around the DeFeo household, known in legal circles as a mid-century dad. As Ron Jr.
Got him?
Yeah. As Ron Jr. grew older, his anger and outbursts continued in frequency and in intensity. And he also outgrew his dad, which was tough. So their shouting matches then turned into boxing matches around the house.
You ever have that moment with your dad?
He's still taller than me.
Oh,
Do you have any idea how much that bothers me? So no, I beat him in foosball though.
Oh, well, that counts.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that was actually.
Well, it takes one.
Oh, the DeFeos sent Ron Jr. to therapy, but that didn't help because in the Tom-honored tradition of psychopaths, Ron Jr. just played the therapist and blamed everything on his parents. So the DeFeos turned to the grand old tradition of placating their bratty little kids and simply spoiled him. By way of example, Ron Jr. was given a $14,000 speedboat for his 14th birthday. So that's like 60s money too. So that's like $100,000.
Yeah. Super cool. It's just super cool. I love this. I love everything about this. It's fine.
Your blood pressure is gonna spike so bad during this episode. I thought, given it was horror adjacent, there's like spooky stuff, I thought you would have been happy.
No, man. It just offends my oft commented on sense of righteousness.
Yeah. Ron DeFeo Jr. was kicked out of his Catholic school at the age of 17, having begun dabbling in what you describe as more serious than usual teenage drugs like LSD and heroin.
LSD, I give a pass to. I regret that. I had no intention of defaming LSD.
Well, it's not good. It's not good to have when your brain's still forming, I believe.
That's true.
Like post age 26. Isn't 26 when your brain has officially stopped forming? And then from that point, it's like the Big Bang and it's reached the biggest it's going to get and then it starts shrinking for the rest of your life?
Sure.
Yeah. And also he was involved in larceny schemes too. It's good to have hobbies as a teen. And unfortunately, Ron Jr.'s concerning behavior was no longer confined to just fights with his dad. On a hunting trip with some friends, he pointed a loaded rifle at a teen that he'd known for years, watching him blankly as he ran away. When the party caught up with the kid later that afternoon, Ron Jr. asked him why he had left so soon. Yeah, this has psychopath written all over it.
That is so chilling. Just someone slowly aiming a gun at you wordlessly and then being like, what was wrong?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is really, yeah. Have you seen interviews with him? Like prison interviews?
I haven't.
Oh, yeah. He's like, he's really scary. He's like kind of a Brooklyn Charles Manson. Like he's got the like Long Island accent.
Oh, God.
But he talks about like, I mean, we'll give some quotes from him later about all of this kind of like quasi-religious demonic mumbo jumbo.
Yeah.
Well, very scary. At the age of 18, Ron Jr. was given a cushy job at his grandfather's Buick dealership, but as you write, he half-assed even that and continued drinking and doing heroin and speed. One evening, a fight broke out between his parents, and Ron Jr. grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun from his room, loaded it, and pointed it at his father, yelling, "Leave that woman alone. I'm gonna kill you, you fat This is it. Oh, I forgot. This is it." He then pulled the trigger, but the gun mysteriously misfired, after which he simply walked out of the room.
Do you think there were signs?
Yeah.
Like, what do you fucking do, man? I'd have that kid committed in a heartbeat. Or at least, like, hire, you're Long Island rich, hire someone to, like, follow him around and be like, make sure he doesn't murder me or anyone else.
I just had a thought.
Go on.
This story could have only come from one of two places. Either Ron Jr., after his arrest, volunteered it, which clearly would have blown up his whole "the devil made me do it" defense, or his own parents told someone else that, oh yeah, our son had a loaded rifle and tried to fire it at his dad, and it just didn't go off, because otherwise he killed everyone else in the house, so that story wouldn't have been able to get out any other way. If it was a week before they were all murdered.
This is one of the most repeated quotes that I can find from him. And it's been cited by a lot of people in a lot of different works. But I do not have a source for it. And I mean like real things, not like internet listicles, like, books.
Maybe he admitted to doing it. Maybe it was some part of his defense at one point because he changed his story, as we'll talk about many, many times.
Yeah.
Maybe it was like I was trying to defend my mother and it just got out of control. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the inciting incident for the murders appeared to be when Ron Jr. stole nearly $23,000 in checks from the car dealership where he worked, his grandfather's car dealership, claiming that he'd been robbed on the way to the bank. When questioned about this, for instance, why it had taken him an extra 2 hours to return following the robbery, he just became obstinate and enraged, causing his father, the Friday before the murders, mind you, to tell him, "You've got the devil on your back." To which Ron Jr. responded, "You fat prick, I'll kill you."
As you got to admire the consistency in messaging. I mean, he had the makings of a PR manager in his.
He stayed on message.
Stayed on message. Yeah.
Like, you should lose weight before I kill you,
and I'll kill you. Also, DeFeo's case went to trial in October of 1975. His attorney, the aforementioned William Weber,
a big player in this episode. Remember that name.
William Weber attempted to have the case thrown out based on the fact that DeFeo had waived his right to counsel when he was first arrested before pivoting to an insanity defense. And boy howdy, DeFeo went in on that. He claimed he heard voices urging him to commit the murders. At one point during questioning, he said, "I killed them all," claiming bizarrely that it was self-defense, continuing, "If I didn't kill my family, they were going to kill me. And as far as I'm concerned, what I did was self-defense, and there was nothing wrong with it. When I got a gun in my hand, there's no doubt in my mind who I am. I am God." He then continued to dig himself deeper, saying that, "I remember feeling very good when asked about his state of mind post-murders, and then going so far as to threaten the prosecuting attorney by saying, if I had any sense, which I don't, I'd come down there and kill you now."
I like that he added the "which I don't," which really it lays the groundwork for that
Wink,
insanity
wink,
defense.
jurors.
Yeah. And this is, again, what makes me think that he's in on it 1,000%. He will do or say anything that, absolves him of this, which is psychopathic behavior.
Yeah.
I guess one of the stories, his story changed a bunch of times. One of the stories he told went something like this on the night of the murders. He was asleep in the living room at home watching a war picture on television after having taken, quote, "some drugs." Specifics were not mentioned. He then awoke at the end of the movie to hear the voices of his family in the other room conspiring to kill him. He would add that a, quote, "female with black hands," or a hooded, black-handed demon, passed him the rifle. Now, remember that hooded, black-handed demon thing, because we'll come back to that.
What do you think he was watching? Paths of Glory? Sands of Iwo Jima? Hells Angels?
Tora.
Okay.
Oh.
Also, not helping any of this is the fact that at one point he asked police when he could collect on his parents' life insurance.
Do you think that the Menendez brothers studied this? Okay, we don't do that. We don't do that. We don't do that. But this seemed to work out okay.
What a bumbling mook. Anyway, none of this panned out. His defense attorney called a psychiatrist who delivered a mini lecture on psychosis, disassociation, and criminal insanity. The further the prosecution psychiatrist would go with was antisocial personality disorder. Subsequently, on Friday, November 21st, 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder.
Second degree?
I don't even know what
is it the,
who cares?
Well, yeah, but it's got to be part of the insanity defense in there. That had to be a concession of that.
Buddy, if you're getting hung up with legal details at this stage of the podcast, this is going to be a two-parter. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison on all 6 counts. Immediately after the trial, he claimed to the press that he'd pled guilty at the behest of his attorney, the aforementioned William Weber, saying, "He gave me no choice. He told me I had to do this. He told me there would be a lot of money from book rights and a movie. He would have me out in a couple of years, and I would come into all that money." While in custody, DeFeo continued to alter his story. In a 1986 interview with Newsweek, he claimed that it was actually his sister Dawn who'd killed their father, before his distraught mother saw what she'd done and killed the rest of the family?
Except him?
He explained that he'd taken the blame because he was afraid to say anything negative about his mother to her father and his father's uncle, who was involved with the Genovese crime family. Later, he switched to this having Dawn as the perpetrator of all the murders before he killed her. And this is probably the most plausible theory, right, Jordan? That Dawn did it?
Yeah, there are a lot of stories that Ron Jr. and Dawn, his sister, were in cahoots together. They had apparently a very close relationship. Some have even speculated that there was some incest involved. I don't know. The story would be that they were plotting to kill their abusive father, but Dawn, for reasons I don't fully understand, got carried away with this evil deed and killed everyone, maybe to eliminate witnesses. I don't know. And then Ron was so heartbroken by what she had done that he went and killed her. It doesn't really hold up, but it is interesting to note that her death appears to have been the most violent, with her head being blown almost entirely off by the rifle blast. Here's where it really gets weird, as if it wasn't already.
Yeah.
I guess we haven't gotten to the demonic pig yet. According to author Rick Osuna, in a 2005 documentary, The Real Amityville Horror, a criminologist hired by the defense team told a closed court that there was evidence that the bodies had been moved and staged post-mortem, and that there was evidence that more than one gun was used. So that would give credence to the idea that there were two people involved in the killings, which would make sense if, there weren't any defensive wounds on everybody, because presumably somebody would have heard something and tried to run for their lives, but it looks like that they were all shot in their sleep, which seems impossible, that nobody would have woken up. Anyway, this gets extremely weird. Journalist Rick Moran was contacted many years after the murder by a drug enforcement agent who told him that he had the DeFeo home under observation at the time of the murder, and he had seen Dawn DeFeo leave the house on the night of the murder with a rifle. The agent said that he saw her put the rifle in the back seat of her car and drive in the direction of the city dock, which was exactly where the weapon was found by police divers later. And this is really interesting. Dawn was dressed in a hooded jacket and dark gloves, leading some to speculate that she was the supposed hooded, black-handed demon that Ron was referring to.
It's interesting because, based on Ron, you think he would be the one who would be, low-key trafficking drugs. Dawn also had a boyfriend around this time who testified in an affidavit that she had been wanting to leave and move to Florida. So maybe she really was a burgeoning drug trafficker.
Oh, maybe. Or maybe it was wrong. I mean, I don't know why the house was under surveillance. I don't think that came up, at least in my research. It could have been Ron. It could have been Dawn. But Dawn's night clothes apparently showed traces of unburnt powder, which would indicate that she might have fired a rifle that night. So your mileage may vary. It could have been some sort of weird pact between brother and sister that went awry at the last minute. I don't know. We'll probably never know.
Rick Osuna released a book in 2002 called The Night the DeFeos Died, which is named after a song that Dawn wrote as a teenager, apparently.
What?
Yeah.
What are the lyrics to that?
I think it had to have been The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, or a Bobby Gentry style talk song that she just did as a bit. But it made its way into Rick Osuna's book, and he titled it after this.
That's terrifying.
Anyway, this is one of the most coherent arguments that Dawn was involved in the murders. Among all the stuff that Jordan just talked about, Osuna does say that the mafia claim doesn't hold water because the killing of children violates the code of the Italian mafia, which, sure, man. But he does bring up a very useful stat, which is that at the time, Suffolk County police had an astronomical confession rate, 95%, compared to 35 in the Bronx and 20 in Kings County, Brooklyn. So Osuna contends that DeFeo, probably withdrawing from any cocktail of drugs or just regular old alcohol, had the crap kicked out of him in a cell and confessed under those circumstances. Both the prosecutor and Amityville police have supposedly admitted on several occasions that the crime would have required 3 people, and an independent investigation by retired police detective Herman Race backed that up. Most importantly, Osuna recalls a moment when George Lutz told him, clearing up what happened isn't as important as making money with the sequels. Kind of want to read this book. Anyway, getting back to Ronnie Boy. You know his nickname was Butch?
Butch, yeah.
We should have mentioned that earlier. On the 2006 A&E special First Person Killers, Ronald DeFeo, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Hoge said that after interviewing Ronald for several hours, he didn't find anything credible about the Dawn story. Rather, he added, "I wouldn't be able to say this was absolutely true, but it made me believe that, in fact, Ronald had killed them." Not a great look. Either way, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was denied parole every single time he came up for it, and he died in prison in 2021 at the age of 69, and that was the end of that.
Nice.
So speaking of George Lutz, land surveyor George and his wife Kathleen bought the Amityville house for what was considered a bargain price of $80,000 plus an additional $400 for much of the furnishing. They'd married in July 1975. Kathy had 3 children from a previous marriage, Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa, and they wanted to start fresh with their blended family and their dog, Harry. During their first inspection of the house, the real estate broker told them about the DeFeo murders and asked if this would affect their decision, but apparently it did not, and the Lutzes moved in on December 18th, 1975, less than a month after DeFeo Jr.'s sentencing.
George would say that within the first hour of arriving at the house, Harry the dog tried to hang himself by hurling himself over the fence. His chain was too short, and he was hung by his neck. He survived. If you learned that the house you were looking at was the site of a, not just any murder, but an especially grisly murder like this, would you have any problem moving into a murder home?
No.
Really?
Wouldn't bother me.
Really?
Yeah, it was just, I mean, you know.
So like a lightning won't strike twice kind of thing? Or
No. If all they're going to do is like turn the lights on and off and move some furniture around, I would be like, hey, guys, I'm really sorry. That's an incredibly shitty thing. Don't do it while company's over.
I'm serious. You wouldn't have any problem moving into a murder house.
I mean, how grisly? Are we talking? There's a sliding scale. I would draw the line at like rape, cannibalism, or like a dungeon that some guy kept his secret family in. Okay. Or like really grisly dismemberment. Little rich kid taking nighttime pot shots. I can live with that.
Why is there a sliding scale?
Dude, I just follow the muse. Sometimes I don't even think about what I'm doing. You know, I'm led by my whims. Where do they move from? I feel like that's an oversight on my part because home buying in the 1970s would have been slower, right? So closing on this house, moving in on December 18th, definitely presupposes that he had been looking into this for like at least months prior, right?
I would assume so, yeah.
Yeah. Gross, grubby little opportunist.
Oh, did he die?
He's super dead.
George Lutz died?
Yeah, and in hell.
Oh, okay, so then I can say whatever I want about him.
Yeah, hell yeah, brother. Anyway, the Lutzes sensibly decided to have a priest come in to bless the house. Another embarrassing Italian-American, Father Ray Pecoraro, arrived, and as Lutz told ABC News in 2002, the priest said he felt an unseen hand slap him in the sewing room, and a voice say, "Get out." Could be a good thing. I mean, usually priests are on the giving end of uncomfortable touching, right? So maybe this was a big shock to him. Per Lutz, Pecoraro then became ill with flu-like symptoms, and his hands began to bleed. I don't think stigmata is connected to haunting. It's usually talked about in cases of like religious ecstasy. What a dipshit. God, I hate this dumb putz. Lutz also said in an interview with MovieWeb that Kathy's aunt, an ex-nun, also visited the house. Continuing to ABC, he detailed the next 28 days. There were odors in the house that came and went. There were sounds. The front door would slam shut in the middle of the night. I couldn't get warm in the house for many days. He also told the network that they found, quote, strange gelatinous drops on the carpet in the mornings, which gross, but attributed to any number of things, gross, and claimed that his wife was physically transformed into an old woman with the face, hair, and wrinkles of a 90-year-old. Among his other claims were visits from the aforementioned demonic pig, Jodie, green ooze dripping down the walls, the children's bed slamming against the floor, and what was determined to be his final straw, Kathy levitating above her bed one night. He also claimed to wake up each night at 3:15 a.m., purportedly the time that the DeFeo murders occurred. Although I've also seen around 2:45. It's a generous window.
That's really interesting to me because I thought that they never spoke publicly about what happened the night they fled the house in the middle of the night. So I don't know what the last straw was.
He has spoken constantly and in so many different variations of it's true what happened, because his whole log line has been like, what happened in those 28 days is true. Everything since then has been embellished, and I am like a perfect, blameless angel in all of that.
Yeah, he would say that he got very sick in the house and lost a lot of weight. He would say that, quote, my own personal hygiene changed there. Not totally sure what that means. He underwent personality changes, supposedly, and was quick to snap at his family while living there. As you mentioned, he had a hard time getting warm and was constantly outside chopping wood and building fires, which is such a hilariously mundane yet menacing thing to do. It's just like angrily chopping wood outside.
That was supposedly an invention for the movie, but I find it funny that it is also the obsessive behavior that Ralph Ineson experiences as the family patriarch in Robert Eggers' timeless classic, The Vavitch.
Doesn't Jack Nicholson? Oh, no, that's a different axe. Never mind.
He used an axe for a different thing.
Different thing, yeah. Kathy Lutz reported being hugged by an old woman who, wasn't really there. They reported swarms of houseflies infesting only certain rooms, despite the fact that it was midwinter. There were your standard run-of-the-mill screams and footsteps in the middle of the night, toilets turning black, china turning black, which I've never heard of. But my favorite is the aforementioned demonic pig named Jodie. It was seen by the Lutz's daughter, Missy, who claimed that she would see its red eyes. Oh, yeah, it has red eyes. That's important. Red eyes peering through her bedroom window on the second floor. According to the little girl, Jodie the pig told her that the pig, was glad she was living there and that she would be living there forever. That's so, I love that. I love that so much. Hilariously, it was later believed that Jodie was in fact a large Persian cat owned by a neighbor who was overfed and known locally as Pig, and had, cats, certain breeds have like reddish eyes. Yeah.
No, it's just at night when the interior light would be shining out at them.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. There was also apparently an innocent explanation of a number of the supernatural, these supposedly.
All of it.
Okay.
All of it. There's explanations for all of it.
There were windows in one of the kids' rooms that supposedly opened and shut on their own at random, and investigators discovered that the windows were improperly counterbalanced, and all you had to do was stand on a certain floorboard to send them up and then release the floorboard.
The house was built in 1923, and the guy tripped over his dick to get into it based on the court case. Of course it's good. Sorry.
So yeah, I don't really understand the physics, but apparently that was the cause of the windows going up and down. And one of the claims from George Lutz is that, the window slammed down on my little boy's hand, and I took him to the hospital. And
Have you ever been in a pre-war house with those stupid pulley window things?
Yes.
I fear for my hands every time I get near one of them.
Well, it gets worse, though. He supposedly took his son to the hospital after the window slammed on his fingers. And then somebody he was debating on one of those debunkathon TV shows was like, okay, we're going to subpoena the hospital and have the hospital records. And then as soon as I said that, he was like, well, I didn't actually take him to the hospital. It was more of a...
Every single time he's pressed on it, he backs off, which is so hilarious, man. At least go through more trouble falsifying records, or even just maybe try doing the shit you would later claim. It's just I think it's because he's stupid. That's what bothers me the most, actually.
You want him to lie better. You don't care that he lied. Yes. You want him to lie better. That's really what it's all about for you.
It's perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'll just falsify this thing, and as it spins out of control, just keep pathetically lying and then live the rest of my life doubling down on it.
I didn't realize he died.
Moron. Yeah, he died. He's in hell. I explained it.
Journalist Rick Moran would cite an estimated 160 obvious physical errors in the book, The Amityville Horror, and that doesn't even count trying to prove or disprove the existence of psychic phenomena. So, yeah.
As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages.
George Lutz wasted very little time getting experts involved after he fled his home. He contacted Stephen Kaplan, the founder and director of the Vampire Research Center and the Parapsychology Institute of America. He agreed to investigate the home with some members of his Parapsychology Institute.
Witches. They were supposedly witches who showed up.
Oh, okay, there you go.
I learned that recently. I didn't have time to edit it. It's just hilarious.
Yeah, this guy was so convinced of the existence of vampirism.
Just vampires.
Oh, okay.
Just say vampires.
Of vampires, that in 2010 he told the New York Post that he was corresponding with 4 vampires in Manhattan, 1 in the Bronx, and 1 in Queens. But shockingly, none in Brooklyn. You would have thought
Hell
in Bushwick there would have been some.
Well, there are now.
Oh, yeah, certainly. This is 2010, though. That was when they would have gotten there, yeah.
They're just looking for crack. Sorry.
Or house shows.
Not at that point.
I don't know. I moved out here in 2011.
I don't know. I mean, well, depending on what part of Bushwick. I feel like down by Knickerbocker was not like gentrified in 2010. But you were there. I wasn't.
I was there. At the first house show at the lodge. I was there.
I told Alex, you'll never make a dime. And you were right. And I was right. All right.
LCD sound system reference, folks. Thank you. There you go.
We're white. We're white men of a certain age.
And talking about 2011 in New York. George Lutz requested that Kaplan, this vampire fetishist who had
expert, thank you very much,
who had a PhD in sociology following his BA in the subject and a master's in education and interdisciplinary studies from SUNY and CUNY Stonebrook, along with his associates at the Parapsychology Institute. Why did you have me read all this? Investigate his home.
Well, because he's actually credentialed in some way. It's funny because so I'm getting ahead of myself. Damn it. Keep going.
Okay, so let's ask this guy who's credentialed to investigate his home. Kaplan wrote a whole book about the whole Amityville situation, very tellingly called The Amityville Conspiracy. And I recall that during his short stay in the house, Lutz said he'd read multiple books about the occult, which I don't find to be a red flag. If you're in a home that you think is haunted and you want to learn more about haunted homes and why that all happens.
In 28 days while going to work or whatever, like...
He was sick. He was sick a lot. He was sick a lot.
He was researching his bullshit.
Kaplan pressed him, and George Lutz recalled the conversation with Ray Buckland, who Kaplan described as a prominent witch in the area who ran the Witchcraft Museum in Bayshore before moving to New England, adding, Ray Buckland had been gone from New York for a year or two now. That would mean that George had researched his craft, as it is called, with one of the most knowledgeable witches in the country long before he bought the house.
Okay. As if he was planning it.
Okay.
And had read a bunch of books.
Do you think that he was just like scanning the newspaper for different horrific murders and was like, oh, that one fits the bill?
No, I mean, well, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Like...
Or maybe he saw the Devil Made Me Do It defense in the newspaper and was like, oh, wait a minute.
I think one of the most prominent conspiracy theories, which I think is by Occam's razor, is likely the real thing, is that he bought this place kind of on maybe a whim or to try and profit off of it in a different way, but then realized that the mortgage was like unsustainable. And
was it though? I thought it was like a bargain. I thought it was a really discounted price because of the history.
I mean, I don't know what the guy's income was. He was lazing around, reading occult books. They like.
Well, what do we do?
Okay, fair. No, I mean that's the theory, is that he was trying to get out of the mortgage, which was unsustainable, and that he was like, I know. But I mean, I don't know, man. The guy was such a bald-faced liar for his entire life that you'll never and he's dead now and in hell, so there's no way you'll ever get him to pinpoint the time, oh, I researched a murder house, thought I could profit off of it, got in trouble with the mortgage, and then decided to fake a haunting so we could leave,
Things stalled out between Kaplan and Lutz when Lutz asked about Kaplan's Institute's fee for investigating his house. Kaplan told him that they didn't charge for the investigation, but that, quote, if the story is a hoax, the public will know. And shortly afterwards, George Lutz called and canceled the investigation, which is suspicious.
And the reason I was getting so angry earlier is that the people that he called are Ed and Lorraine Warren, who have achieved their whole thing was getting famous for being paranormal investigators and psychics. They never charged for doing any of this, but they profited immensely off of books and speaking engagements and the like. They are probably the most famous paranormal investigators in American history, thanks to the Conjuring franchise, which, as we will get into, contains some amazing liberties with their story, mandated due to their disgusting lives. So Ed Warren had like a long-standing grudge against Stephen Kaplan because Kaplan's whole thing was like, I will investigate this, but if it's a hoax, I will reveal it. Whereas the Warrens' whole thing was investigating things and then making up bullshit that they then continued to profit off of. So Ed Warren was like in this one-sided battle with Stephen Kaplan and just constantly lying about him every time he got a microphone put in front of him. Like, that man has no credentials. He like is blah, blah, blah. He's this, he's that. And just carried on this personal attack because they were the second choice for investigating an Amityville house because they were credulous and also scam artists. Anyway, that was all off the dome. I didn't even write that. You just made me so angry. So Ed Warren supposedly grew up in a haunted house in Connecticut, remembering paranormal experiences from as early as when he was 9 years old. He enlisted in the Navy in September of 1943 after being rejected by the Marines for lying about his age. He was 17. I don't know if I buy that. Sounds like something you'd lie about. Supposedly, a ship Ed was on collided with an oil tanker in the North Atlantic in 1945, and after being evacuated from the burning ship, Ed bobbed in the icy waters, praying for help, and was soon rescued. He returned home and immediately asked Lorraine, whom he'd met when she was 16, to marry him. Lorraine, unsurprisingly, also remembered being psychic from a young age, and less than 10 years later, the couple founded the New England Society for Psychic Research in 1952, after first attempting to make a living off of Ed's paintings. He's just a frustrated painter. Turned to manipulating people's feelings, and
history's littered with frustrated painters. No good comes of it.
Nailed it. Wait.
You folks will get that one on the way home.
You should probably just cut that in instead of having me unlock my phone and pull up every time. Anyway, they claim to have investigated thousands of cases of paranormal phenomena. And while they didn't, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't charge for investigations, but they made a killing off of this hustle.
Speaking engagements.
Yeah, and books, and they were on they were all over talk shows for a long time too. It was just like in the kind of Wild West of 70s and 80s talk shows, if somebody needed to plug something, they would just call up the Warrens and be like, "What have you done lately?" And they'd be like, "Well, there's a haunted doll." That's not a joke. Annabelle. I mean, the number of sorry, I'm putting the scammer ahead of the horse. Ed and Lorraine were devout Catholics, and Lorraine often claimed that atheism was what opened the door to demonic spirits and paranormal. What a bitch. Ed claimed to be, sometimes along with his wife, quote, the only non-clerical demonologists recognized by the Vatican. Sometimes he would sub in the phrase, church approved. However, Brad Miner, senior editor of a website called The Catholic Thing, and a senior fellow of the Faith and Reason Institute, wrote in a 2016 article, if ever there were an actual recognition or endorsement by Rome of their activities, I can't find it. The couple did work with local Catholic priests frequently during the course of their investigation and alleged to have received a personally assigned exorcist from the Vatican to assist in one case from none other than the future Pope Benedict, then a sprightly young Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was known. That was the Nazi youth guy, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, great. The company they keep. Aside from the Amityville case, the Warrens were best known for their involvement in a murder case in Connecticut in which the defendant, Arne Johnson, sought to argue that he had been possessed by the devil. The judge in the case disallowed the argument, and Mr. Johnson was convicted of manslaughter. That story has been adapted into one of the installments of the Conjuring franchise, which I'm about to get to. The fine folks at New Line Cinema, owned by Warner Brothers, are responsible for not just the Conjuring franchise, which I think is 3 or 4 deep at this point, and they star in these films, by the way. Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga star as the Warrens and have a glowing, lovely, faith-informed relationship and are just like the saints upon the earth combating the forces of the devil. This has since sprawled into the Annabelle series, which is I think a haunted Raggedy Ann doll that they have in their museum of bullshit that they probably charge people to get into, and the Nun franchise. All of these has been responsible for polishing the Warrens' reputation, and we'll get into that. Regardless of your views on the supernatural, this pop culture image of them papers over a lot. First of all, they were definitely con artists. The Warrens had a best-selling 1992 book called In a Dark Place, which was co-written with author Ray Garton, and eventually made into the 2009 horror film The Haunting in Connecticut. Ray Garton has given multiple interviews stemming from his hiring by the Warrens to ghostwrite this book. He alleges that this has been the case with a number of horror writers retained by the Warrens, uses the phrase nearly identical, and after approaching Ed with concerns about the inconsistencies of the testimonies in the material he was provided to write the book, was told by Ed, "They're crazy. All the people who come up to us are crazy. That's why they come up to us. Just use what you can and make the rest up. You write scary books, right? Well, make it up and just make it scary. That's why we hired you." Garton also added that there are questions about the legitimacy of the Catholic priests who worked with the Warrens, and that his motivation for spilling, he says, is that the book was marketed without his consent as non-fiction, as the Warrens had shifted from house hauntings to the possessions after the popularity of The Exorcist. So that guy at least has an axe to grind, but telling stuff. One family member of the Devil Made Me Do It case, Carl Glatzel, also sued the Warrens in 2007, claiming that the book that they'd written was made of complete lies, and that the Warrens, quote, concocted a phony story about demons in an attempt to get rich and famous at our expense. He suggested then that the Warrens slandered him by passing off his skepticism about the case as merely a facet of the demonic entity's power over the entire situation. What a convenient out. Hey, I think you guys are bullshit. That's just what a devil-possessed man would say. Adding fuel to this, there's the fact that the Warrens have never produced definitive proof behind any of their cases. Their photos of the Amityville house were fake, and in one 1990 incident, Ed Warren described a film that he took of a female spirit haunting a cemetery. It was never made public, and was eventually, allegedly, revealed to be a woman named Judith Penny wearing a white bedsheet over her head.
So they went full Scooby-Doo ghost with this.
Yeah.
They didn't even, okay. So that name, Judy Penny, is tremendously important because in 2017, The Hollywood Reporter published a lengthy article about the fantastically profitable partnership between New Line Cinema, who does all the Conjuring movies, and the Warrens. As of that article's publication, The Hollywood Reporter suggests that all Warren-related films have grossed over $1.2 billion with a B, dollars worldwide, and that number is probably approaching $3 billion as of this podcast. That is astonishing. The Hollywood Reporter contends that just weeks after the first Conjuring movie hit theaters in 2013, studio executives were made aware of allegations from Judith Penny that in the early 60s, when she was 15 years old, Ed initiated a relationship with her with Lorraine's knowledge, claiming in a sworn declaration in November 2014 that she lived with the Warrens as Ed's lover for 4 decades. Fuck you for forcing me to say lover.
Which, fine, man. Whatever weird shit you want to get up to in the, in your own house is fine with a consenting adult, not a teenager. But the degree to which they've been lying about this. Go on.
Judith Penny alleged that she met the Warrens before they were the Warrens, internationally famous paranormal experts, I'll say. You will say con artists. At the time, Ed Warren was just a city bus driver for Bridgeport, Connecticut, and she moved into their home in 1963.
He met her on the bus she took to get to high school.
Oh, my. Oh, wow. It gets, allegedly, so much worse. Judith Penny was arrested in 1963 after someone reported her relationship with Ed, and she spent a night in prison while police tried to get her to sign a statement admitting to the affair. She refused to cooperate and was ordered to report to a delinquent youth office every week for a month, which Ed dutifully drove her to. That's good boyfriend material right there.
Keep going.
Then, in May 1978, when she was in her 30s, Judith Penny said she became pregnant with Ed's child and claimed Lorraine persuaded her to have an abortion because the birth of a child could become public and any scandal could ruin the Warrens' business.
Which again is predicated on their heartfelt Christianity and that the idea that atheism opens the door to the devil.
I mean, as Judith Penny said, Lorraine's real god is money.
Man, I set you up for that one.
That was good. In her sworn statement, Judith Penny recalled, "They wanted me to tell everyone that someone had come into my apartment and raped me, and I wouldn't do that. I was so scared, I didn't know what to do, but I had an abortion. The night they picked me up from the hospital after having it, they went out and lectured and left me alone." As if all of this wasn't enough, she also alleges that Ed was physically abusive to his wife, Lorraine. Both Warrens had died by the time Judith Penny's sworn statement and the Hollywood Reporter article were publicized.
And in hell.
Their organization is currently run by their daughter, Jodie. He named their daughter after the 15-year-old that he took in and had an affair with.
Actually, let me check that real quick, because I didn't pick up on that, honestly. I was so in the weeds. I was seeing so much red.
Anyway, the folks running the Warrens' estate now shot down Judith Penny's story, telling their attorney the Warrens opened their home to Miss Penny when she was 18 and had nowhere else to live following a childhood of neglect. During much of their career, Ed and Lorraine were on the road, working on cases and giving lectures, and Miss Penny lived at and watched their house.
Okay, so no, it was a complete coincidence that the teenage mistress that he bullied and sex trafficked was named after their first daughter, who was born in 1946. Oh, and New Line Cinema outside counsel Michael O'Connor received a letter from an attorney named Sanford Dow representing one of the two parties suing the studio, more on that in a minute, in 2015 that read, in part, Mr. Warren has been accused of being cut from the exact same cloth as convicted Penn State football child molester Jerry Sandusky and the accused sexual predator Bill Cosby. Mrs. Warren, in both condoning and covering up these heinous acts, is as complicit as her husband. Speaking of Lorraine, The Hollywood Reporter also delved into Lorraine's contract with New Line. The talent attorney that they contacted to review this for the piece, Jill Smith, told them that it contained restrictions to a degree of specificity she had never seen before. To wit, Lorraine's deal with New Line to serve as consultant on or model for The Conjuring included some unusually specific restrictions. The film couldn't show her or her husband engaging in crimes. Sure. Sex with minors? Okay. Child pornography? Prostitution or sexual assault? Neither the husband nor wife could be depicted as participating in an extramarital sexual relationship, which is like that tweet, my not involved in human trafficking t-shirt is raising a lot of questions already answered by my t-shirt. And that is literally what Lorraine did with this enormously lucrative contract from New Line. So remember when I said two people were suing over this situation? Bolstering Penny's account of things is an author named Gerald Brittle. He's suing New Line and Warner's, claiming that the Conjuring franchise rips off his 1980 book, The Demonologist. Part of Brittle's lawsuit alleges that the studio was complicit in covering up Penny to keep their franchise profitable. And his book even mentioned her by name in the context of a 1974 investigation describing her as, quote, a young woman who works as a liaison when Ed and Lorraine are out of town. Producer Tony DeRosa Grund is also suing the studio over The Conjuring, alleging that he alerted a number of top brass and creatives involved with the first film after its release. He wrote in an email, Ed was a pedophile, a sexual predator, and a physically abusive husband. Lorraine enabled Ed to do this. She knowingly allowed this illegal, read criminal, relationship to continue for 40 years. They lied to the public. His lawsuit alleges that he's been locked out of profits since the first film, although he hasn't crossed the Rubicon of claiming that it's because he raised these objections. So that's all horrible. But back to the other amoral profiteers at the center of this story. In March 76, right about the time the Warrens got involved, William Weber, who you remember was Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s attorney, sent a book contract to the Lutzes, which detailed a proposed company to be formed between Weber, two other paranormal specialists who investigated the house, not the Warrens, and a writer named Paul Hoffman. Weber, according to the New York Times, had met the Lutzes after they abandoned the house, and he was supposedly helping them out with their mortgage situation. But Weber also hoped to collaborate on a book about the murders, which was then titled Devil on My Back, alleging that the Lutzes, as he later testified in state Supreme Court, were interested in, quote, developing the demonism aspect of the case. DeFeo, from prison, asserted in a letter that Weber and the Lutzes were plotting all of this as my trial was in progress, and that the Lutzes, Weber, and the writer Paul Hoffman had allegedly had brainstorming sessions in January of 1976, a month after they moved in.
I don't understand how it's not a massive conflict of interest that a defense attorney who used the defense on one of his clients, he was possessed by demons, could then get in contact with the person who bought the house and was claiming, the house is haunted, and then sought to profit off of that. I don't understand how that's in any way legal.
Per Weber's proposal, the Lutzes were to receive 24% of the shares in this corporation, while Hoffman, the writer, would get the largest at 40%. This irked the Lutzes, who decided instead to partner up with author Jay Anson in March of 1976 for a more lucrative 50% split. This is the guy who wrote the book that the movie was based on. Hoffman, however, has the distinction of being the first person to publish anything about the hauntings. First in the New York Sunday News on July 18th, 1976, and then later in an April 1977 issue of, hilariously, Good Housekeeping. Jay Anson's only claim to any expertise in the paranormal was that he'd been working as a writer for a company that produced promotional material, like behind-the-scenes shorts, essentially, for films. He'd done around 500 of them, features for 1971's Clute, 1972's Deliverance, among them. And he was working on a short documentary about the making of The Exorcist when he met that film's technical advisor, Father John Nicola. The two of them apparently got on like the proverbial house on fire, and they discussed writing a book tentatively titled Psychology of the Devil for publishing house Prentice Hall. That deal never came to pass, but years later, an editor at Prentice Hall heard the Lutz's story, supposedly from a friend of George Lutz, who straight up walked into the Prentice Hall headquarters in New Jersey and asked how someone gets a book published. And then that editor called Jay Anson. In a 1978 interview with the New York Times, Anson says he wrote the book from tapes that the Lutzes made recalling their experiences, and from interviews with the local priest, Ralph J. Pecoraro, the aforementioned Italian-American embarrassment. One of. He's fictionalized in the book as Father Mancuso, along with many of the couple's relatives and Suffolk County Police. Incredibly, Anson had a heart attack shortly after accepting the gig and wrote it during his 3 months of recovery. The Lutzes split his $4,000 advance with him and earned a share of the book's profits. Anson collected from paperback rights $200,000, and then on the film rights $200,000 plus his fee as a screenwriter. It's worth noting that he died shortly afterwards. I can't say whether or not he's in hell.
I can. We'll touch on that later. There's some great quotes from him.
Okay.
But yeah, he didn't seem like a great guy.
No. Almost, yeah, he's like crowing about it in all of these interviews. Like, I got my first novel's an enormous hit. Who does that happen to? And it's like, well, sensationalist profiteers, you hack. The real life priest, everything because all of the stuff that his defense of this book is so irking, which is that he's just like, I think they believe it happened. I'm not claiming anything. But then, like, in another interview, when people are calling him on factual errors in it, he's like, I'm not perfect. Sometimes I make mistakes. Oh, that guy. Anyway, almost immediately, people came for this book, which was subtitled A True Story, and it was published in September of 1977. Here is but a smattering.
The real-life priest you just mentioned, Father Pecoraro, said in an affidavit during one of the many lawsuits over the book that his only contact with the Lutzes had been over telephone. So he hadn't actually set foot in the house and got his wrist slapped by a she-demon, as he claimed.
Although later,
he gave an interview on the 1979 interview of In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, and he recanted this, saying that he was indeed slapped by an invisible force and told to get out by a disembodied voice.
Wonderful.
The home's next owners, Jim and Barbara Cromartie, who bought the home for $55,000 in March 1977 after the Lutzes fled, refuted claims that the home's doors, locks, and windows had been damaged, saying that they appeared to all be the original items and not repaired. in other interviews, they said the house was in perfect condition, despite the Lutz's claims that
Door being ripped off.
Yeah, the
by
whole place
demonic forces.
Yes. Meanwhile, the quote-unquote hidden red room in the book was a small closet in the basement that wasn't concealed in any way.
Yeah, they make it out to be this whole doorway to hell thing, and you get down there and it's just like a plumbing closet.
Jim Cromartie would say of his 10-year stay in the home, nothing weird ever happened, except for people coming by because of the book and movie.
The book claims that the Amityville Historical Society told Lutz that his property was on or near land that the Shinnecock Indian Nation had used as, quote, an enclosure for the sick, mad, and dying. But he goes on to claim that the tribe hadn't buried anyone there because the property was infested with demons. And he made the key mistake of coming after a historical society because those people will wreck you if you misquote them. In an article for Newsday, the society's curator denied ever making such fantastic statements, and that the Shinnecock tribe was not known to have lived in the Amityville area. All of the Native Americans on Long Island were part of the Montucket Nation, but the Massapequa tribe lived closest to Amityville.
Yeah, there was a deep trance medium who made similar claims that basically it's the old house was built on an old Indian burial ground routine. There was a local TV station that brought a whole crew of professional paranormal investigators, aka charlatans, to the property in the 70s. And one psychic recalls throwing holy water at invisible specters and seeing the water hiss as if it were thrown onto a hot stove. Lorraine Warren, of course, was present, and she recalled saying, I hope this is as close to hell as I ever get.
It would not be, because she's in hell right now.
This is like the late era Lenny Bruce routines when he just gets up on stage with like transcripts of his obscenity trials and just like quotes from it and just angrily. And he's like not telling jokes. He's just like furiously arguing his point.
This whitewashing thing, it just drives me up a damn wall.
I know. Hilariously, though, the TV reporters claim that while all these psychics around them were losing their mind when they went to investigate the house, none of the reporters themselves saw or felt anything.
Shocker.
A photo of this night appears to reveal the figure of a little boy peeking out from a bedroom where one of the DeFeo children were killed. There were, in fact, no kids in the house that night. The photo was shown to the Lutz's daughter, the same one who saw Jodie the demon pig, and she apparently said, "Oh, that's the boy I used to play with," which was news, supposedly, to George Lutz and his wife. What do you have to say about that? Those pictures were faked?
Were they?
It's a spooky photo. Have you seen that picture?
No.
Do you want to see it?
No. Those fairy kids in Britain like pulled the wool. Yeah. It was like a national mind losing mass delusion over fairies because they like held pasted images up on a stick and it fooled. Who did it fool? Like C.S. Lewis, right? Somebody or the pederast, the Peter Pan guy.
I thought it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books.
Oh, you're right. Yes, sorry. Apologies to the pederast. Yeah. The Sherlock Holmes author was like, "My God, what an incredible factual demonstration!" And they were paper cutouts. Researchers Rick Moran and Peter Jordan rejected the book's claim of cloven hoof prints in the snow on January 1st, 1976, by simply pointing out that there had been no snowfall recorded during that time. No neighbors reported anything unusual during the time that the Lutzes were living there.
But the snowfall thing, it was so cold there that it snowed just over the house. Remember, that's what happens when houses are haunted. Right. It gets really cold.
I forgot about that.
That's why he couldn't get warm. He was always outside chopping wood because of...
Yeah, right. I forgot about that. Great. Wow. Gee. Police officers are written about having visited the house in the book and the film, but records show that the Lutzes did not call the police. There was no bar in Amityville called the Witch's Brew. There was one called Henry's, but that's not quite as snappy, is it? And our old friend Stephen Kaplan, the vampire guy, pointed out that the book's text evolved inconsistently with each new edition.
Oh, wow.
In the original hardcover edition, the priest's car is described as, quote, an old tan Ford, though in later editions, the car is a Chevy Vega, and then becomes a Ford again.
That's hilarious.
Part of the reason that there were so many editions that came out was because people who were mentioned in the book kept suing them. Marvin Scott, an anchorman for the local Channel 5 TV news, Steve Bauman, a reporter, and Sergeant Pat Camamarodo, Italians, of the Amityville Police Department, all sued the publisher. So they had to keep writing these guys out in these new editions because of the litany of bullshit that's in there. Despite all of this, the book was a bestseller upon its release in September of 1977. Who was it said you never go broke underestimating the stupidity of the American public? Anyway, by March of 1979, Writer's Digest contended that it was on its 13th hardcover printing with at least 2 million in paperback sales.
H.L. Mencken, by the way.
Oh, man. Balmer icon, H.L. Mencken. Also, I believe one of his notable quotes is, "There comes a man in every time's life when he is tempted to wash his hands, hoist the black flag, and begin slitting throats." I don't know. I like H.L. Mencken.
Every normal man must be tempted at times to spit on his hands, hoist the black flag, and begin slitting throats.
There it was. All of these reprints were mandated by this legal action, which is why an executive for Bantam Books, who published the paperback edition, told the Washington Post in September of 1979, 2 years after the Amityville Horror was published, that, quote, half the Western world is getting sued over the book. In addition to all the aforementioned lawsuits, the couple that moved into the house after the Lutzes, the Cromarties, sued the Lutzes, Jay Anson, and the publishers of Amityville Horror, alleging that the book wasn't just an invasion of privacy, but that, quote, false misrepresentations were made willfully and solely for commercial exploitation. This was, as we'll see as a common theme, settled out of court. The Cromarties, it must be said, came at this thing from all angles. They supposedly asked for too much money to allow the film to shoot at their house. And then a December 1980 New York article reported that they had teamed with a producer and a New York Post reporter to craft their own film called The Amityville Horror Hoax, but that never got released.
They're the people who bought the house after the Lutzes.
Anson, for his part, never copped publicly to any of this just unmitigated horse, claiming that he'd simply written from what Lutz had given him and frequently repeating some variation on, "I believe the Lutzes believed that it happened."
He's the guy who wrote the Amityville Horror book.
He lived just long enough to enjoy the book's success, dying in March of 1980.
Yeah, he was apparently a real piece of work. A parapsychologist named Peter Jordan tells the story that he talked to Jay around the time the book was, starting to blow up. And Jay told him, "I predict one day you'll be sitting there broke writing your little not ghost stories, and I'm going to be on an island in the Bahamas with a truckload of cashmere sweaters."
Quote machine, though.
And then he later said, this guy Peter Jordan later said, "Yeah, when I heard that he died, I thought, oh no, he never got to enjoy those cashmere sweaters."
Apex petty.
Yes,
I love it.
Yes. Jay Anson also told journalist Rick Moran, "I'm a writer. My only goal is to write a bestseller and build a house in Mallorca and never have to write again." Lots of pieces of work in this story.
I would say pride and greed are both deadly sins, so he's probably in hell as well. Picking up my lapsed Catholicism just to dispel eternal damnation on people. Before we even get to the movie, we should settle the other cloud of lawsuits hanging over all of this. In May of 1977, George and Kathy Lutz filed suit against the aforementioned writer Paul Hoffman, the attorney William Weber, these two paranormal investigators, Good Housekeeping, the New York Sunday News, and the Hearst Corporation. Because, as you recall, they pulled out of a deal with all of these people because they weren't happy with their split, and then Hoffman wrote some articles about it regardless. The Lutzes alleged invasion of privacy, misappropriation of name for trade purposes, and negligent infliction of mental distress, seeking $4.5 million for damages.
They're public figures, and somebody wrote a news story about them. It makes no sense.
Well, it's because they didn't have control over it, you see.
Well, I know, I see that.
Otherwise, they can't get off. And that's what this is all about. Subsequently, Hoffman, Weber, and Burton countersued them for like $6.5 million for fraud and breach of contract. The case went to trial with one judge who immediately dismissed the claims against the publishers of the story and then handed it off to another judge Jack B. Weinstein. This guy is a minorly famous Brooklyn judge known as something of a hard ass. And hilariously, he dismissed the Lutz's suit in 1979, but allowed the countersuit to continue, saying, "Based on what I've heard, it appears to me that a large extent the book is a work of fiction, relying in a large part on the suggestions of Mr. Weber." So, to reiterate, the Lutzes sued, being red-assed about their split over the publishing of this story, and then were countersued, and a judge dismissed their claim for being horseshit before allowing the countersuit to continue. That said, Weinstein took William Weber to task for ethical violations, saying there's a very serious ethical question when lawyers become literary agents, and proposed moving this whole thing up to the State Bar Association, at which point a rattled Weber settled his countersuit for a mere $2,500 in what I have seen quoted as 24 hours after this judgment was handed down. Before that suit was settled, though, William Weber was maneuvering with yet another writer to get more cash out of this DeFeo case. In a letter to DeFeo in custody, in June of 1979, Weber urged his client to participate with a guy named Hans Holzer, who was a paranormal investigator. Holzer was offering to pay DeFeo, another paranormal investigator, and naturally, the attorney, Weber, $2,000 each for an interview to be used in a televised special. Holzer had authored over 140 books on ghosts, the afterlife, witchcraft, and so forth. He investigated the Amityville house with a medium named Ethel Johnson Myers in 1977. Holzer, apparently unaware that the Shinnecock tribe never lived in Amityville, wrote that his medium channeled the spirit of a Shinnecock chief named Rolling Thunder, like the Bob Dylan tour, who'd, gasp, possessed Ronald DeFeo to commit the 1974 murders. Rolling Thunder, speaking through this medium, explained that the house did indeed stand on an ancient Indian burial ground, which contradicts the book's account that it was not used as a burial ground because the vibes were too bad. Holzer took photographs of bullet holes from the 1974 murders in which he claimed mysterious halos had appeared. And ultimately, the guy got what he wanted out of this. He, regardless of all this top to bottom lying, he wrote his own book about the situation, which was adapted for the Amityville Horror sequel, 1982's Amityville 2, The Possession. And then he eked out 2 more novels about it. Perhaps needless to say, according to the Amityville Historical Society, a guy named William Eardley was commissioned in 1913 by the state of New York to copy down old cemetery records because a lot of the Amityville cemeteries were either abandoned or neglected. His findings concluded that most of these cemeteries were moved or relocated to bigger incorporated cemeteries, but that there was no report or any indication of any cemetery of any kind residing on or near the Amityville house.
Isn't the Amityville house like on the water?
It is. It is a waterfront property in Long Island, which ain't cheap.
Well, yeah, but I mean, isn't it generally considered a bad idea to build cemeteries extremely close to the water because it tends to...
Gosh, an excellent
flood?
point, Jordan. An excellent point. Wow. Anyway, attorney and scumbag William Weber learned his lesson from his court case, though, and subsequently gave a famous interview to People magazine in September of 1979. This is one of the most famous Amityville quotes. And he said, "I know this book's a hoax. We created this horror story over many bottles of wine. I told George Lutz that Ronnie DeFeo used to call the neighbor's cat a pig. George was a con artist. He improvised on that, and in the book, he sees a demon pig through the window." In those halcyon days of May of 2001, when a hopeful nation turned its eyes towards the Twin Towers, saying nothing will ever happen to them, Geraldine DeFeo, who is Ron Butch DeFeo's wife, requested that Judge Weinstein unseal the remainder of the Lutz versus Weber files. She had to prove, of course, that she was legitimately married to Ronnie DeFeo, which was a whole thing. And she was. The judge granted the request, and one of the unsealed files contained under oath testimony from Father Ray Pecoraro that the events described in Anson's book never transpired. And speaking of Father Ray, the year after, in May of 2002, the Diocese of Rockville Center finally broke its years of silence, responding to a letter from our boy Rick Osuna, which read in part, "The diocese maintains that this story was a false report. In November of 1977, diocesan attorneys prepared a substantial list to be submitted to the publisher of the Amityville Horror of numerous inaccuracies, factually incorrect references, and untrue statements regarding events, persons, and occurrences that never happened." It also adds that Pecoraro took a leave of absence in May of 1978. Some people have said he was defrocked, and never returned to work for the diocese before his death in 1987. Lastly, Lutz's lies, alliteration, may have been cross-denominational. Questioned about Ray Pecoraro in September of 1979, he told the Washington Post that there were a number of priests involved who will never be told about. Also a rabbi.
Just doubling down, hedging his bets.
I realize that people are going to tune out, even as good as your edit of this will inevitably be, and people are going to tune out because there is so much damn stuff out there about this. But this is a pile of unmitigated horse people. I cannot stress that enough. Before God and the courts of man, this stuff is all made up by a couple of grifters. God,
it is shocking how few at the base of this there are, and then they brought in all these other professional con artists who had a vested interest in playing along with it. But it really is astonishing how it's basically like the Lutzes and the attorney Weber. And then they got the Warrens in because they knew they'd play along with anything. And then a bunch of screenwriters and authors who were like, yeah, I want to, this sounds like it'll sell a lot of copies. Yeah, I'll write whatever you want.
What's it pay?
Yeah.
This is always the first question. Yeah, what's it pay? They hear number? Yeah, I'll do it.
Yep. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
So how'd we get a movie about this regional hoax and best-selling book of lies? So glad you asked.
Yes. Largely, we have Samuel Z. Arkoff of American Pictures International to thank. AIP is a classic B-movie studio. They made a ton of movie with Roger Corman throughout the 50s and 60s, doing my beloved kitschy stuff like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and the Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon Beach Party movies. Into the 70s, they were notable for releasing not just the Amityville Horror, but blaxploitation stuff like Blackula and Pam Grier's early films. And they also imported the original Mad Max, too, which is very cool. This Samuel Arkoff guy, he's pretty hilarious, not just for overseeing all of this, but also for coining, and we use this term loosely, a formula, and we use that term loosely for successful low-budget movies. And he named this formula after himself. It's an acronym, ARKOFF, ARKOFF, and it's a checklist. A is for action, R is for revolution, controversial themes or ideas. K is for killing, a modicum of violence. O is for oratory, notable dialogue and speeches. F is for fantasy, acted out fantasies common to the audience. And the other F is for fornication, because sex sells. Heigl, you have a checklist, a Heigl checklist for when you do podcasts, right? Hate everything in great loudness. I was proud of that.
It was good. No, it was good.
Yeah, thanks.
I love this guy.
Yeah, he's pretty funny.
First of all, that's a great formula for a B movie.
It is, yeah, it is.
And second of all, coining a formula after your own name
I know.
as an acronym is what chutzpah.
It's so good. Samuel Arkoff had supposedly been casting around for something he could do to hit on the order of Jaws, which basically invented the modern summer blockbuster when it was released in 1975. He went off on vacation one year and left a copy of the Amityville Horror on his kitchen table. While he was gone, his daughter read it, and when Arkoff returned, she had already enlisted Milton Moritz, a senior VP of advertising and publicity, to convince her dad to pick up the rights. Arkoff, in a very crafty bit of maneuvering, contacted CBS asking to produce a film as a theatrical release, but he offered them rights to broadcast it on their network as a trade. You want to explain that?
Oh, well, I mean, made-for-TV movies were a huge thing at this time. Like, Salem's Lot, the Stephen King adaptation, was like Tobe Hooper directed that. John Carpenter directed a made-for-TV movie around this time. So, presumably there was some calculus by the studio that was like, well, if we get exclusive rights to broadcast this, we can juice some ratings out of it, and we'll just pick up the rights, which weren't that expensive as far as these things go. I don't know, $200,000, and is that in?
It's like $2 million.
I guess that was $2 million today's money for book rights.
Well, the film rights sold for what you note as a semi-low $200,000, though most parties involved earned percentage splits as well. The book's author, Jay Anson, had already written a teleplay based on the book, but Arkoff subsequently hired screenwriter Sandor Stern, another incredible name, to rework Anson's teleplay for a feature film.
All right, casting. My voice is starting to wear out. Margot Kidder, who plays the family's matriarch, was then coming off the huge success of Superman, in which she obviously starred as Lois Lane to Christopher Reeve's Superman. Although she'd done a few horror films prior, like Brian De Palma's Sisters and Black Christmas, which some people hail as the first true slasher film, Kidder didn't seem to put too much stock in the Amityville horror. She told People magazine of the film, "I suppose I believe in the possibility of many things, but I think pigs snorting in windows is taking it a bit far. But I laughed all the way through The Exorcist, so I'm not a good person to comment, and the Amityville horror is extremely successful."
In a later interview, she'd put it more simply. At that stage, you took the jobs you were offered and took the money. Do you know she was married to the dad from Home Alone, John Hurd?
I did not.
Yeah, they were separated 6 days later. She has 3 marriages that were shorter than 1 year under her belt, which is sad. Her whole story is sad.
It's really sad.
Yeah. After her death in 2018, she was cremated, and her ashes were scattered by her brother in her favorite childhood locations in Canada and also in Montana, amongst lilies often eaten by grizzly bears, thus partially fulfilling her wish to, quote, have her body just left out there for the bears.
Why does it have to be bears, man?
Now I'm curious.
AIP secured Stuart Rosenberg, who directed friggin' Cool Hand Luke
Whoa.
as the director of the film. This ended up being his only horror film, which scans. It's not good. Kiddo said that Rosenberg did as much as he could to help the atmosphere on set, and much of it related directly to your beloved Jodie. She said, he tried to scare me all the time. In one scene, a pig was supposed to come at the window, and he had the prop department make a pig. It was a bright orange pig, like a stuffed animal with plastic eyes. And he would put it up at the window to scare me, but every time I saw it, I just laughed. And Jordan, I'm sure you'll be delighted to know that Fred J. Kohnkamp, who worked on the Poseidon Adventure and the Towering Inferno, was cinematographer on Amityville.
That's amazing.
I keep seeing this fact that's repeated about him, that he was like afraid of flies and like had such a hard time filming all the scenes involving flies that he like lost 30 pounds on set and couldn't even look through the lens. He would just point the camera at the flies and look away, hoping for a good shot. But I wasn't able to verify that. But it is funny.
Apparently Margot just loved grizzlies, by the way. That's a quote from her brother. She loved grizzlies.
Nice. The producer's job in swaying James Brolin, however, was made easier for them by a set of pants, as the star explained to the AV Club.
I love this.
Other names floated were Harrison Ford after the unexpected success of the first Star Wars, Burt Reynolds, James Caan, and Christopher Reeve. Anyway, Brolin was shooting Robert Butler's neo-noir action film Night of the Juggler, which is not a fever dream I just had, when someone told him about the Amityville project. He recalled being told, there's no script, but you ought to read this book, The Amityville Horror, because they'll have the script soon, and they would really like to have you do it. Brolin went on to explain, so I was reading this novel at night, and it's 2 a.m. Well, I would hang my pants on the door of the bedroom. I'd throw them over the top corner of the main door coming into the bedroom. Yes, James, that's how that works. All of a sudden, the pants fell off the door onto the floor. How I didn't hit my head on the ceiling, I have no idea, because I was at a scary part of this book, and it so surprised me I started laughing after I recovered and said, I've got to do this movie. And that's how that happened. James Brolin was kind of an idiot, right? Like, he just seems like a tall, benign dumbass.
Yeah, from what little I know about him, that sounds about right.
Just a big old himbo.
Sweet, yeah.
Yeah,
sweet
everyone
man.
said how nice he was, totally. But my God. My pants fell off the door, so I was moved to do this movie. Brolin took a lower
I've never heard of anyone in my entire life do that with their pants. Have you?
I mean, in a pinch maybe, but it's just so funny how he patiently went on to describe the process of it. And here's how I hung the pants.
I put it on the
Club.
corner. Yeah.
Brolin took a lower payment up front for a cut of the profits, which obviously turned out really well for him. Fun fact, his brother Brian Bruderlin, which is his name, he changed it to Brolin, was used for an image of a bearded man coming out of the Red Room in the cellar, who is supposed to be Ronald DeFeo. The studio wanted someone who bore a close resemblance to Brolin, discovered he had a brother, and slapped a fake beard on him. So the gist is that Ronald DeFeo's demonic spirit is coming out of the Red Room, and Josh Brolin's character sees himself in it. Again, all horse. An amazing bit of micro-niche trivia is that Bruderlin was more of an audio guy than an actor. He owned a studio and was an engineer on, among others, 1971's Merry Christmas from the Brady Bunch.
That's incredible. I'm so glad. I never thought we'd get to the Brady Bunch with this.
Yeah. I don't think there's a Beatles one later, though.
I'll figure something.
You'll force it. Yeah.
I'll think about it.
You'll force it. Brolin followed his marching orders, though. He was a good soldier. In interviews about the film, he dutifully repeats the book's falsehoods and goes to bat for the Lutz family. He told the Fort Lauderdale News in 1979, "I'm not superstitious, but I have an open mind about what happened in that Amityville house. I simply ask, why would George Lutz move out of his dream house, abandon a business which had been in his family for 3 generations, and flee to San Diego with his wife and 3 children for nothing? Just to have a book written about it? Yes, James, that's exactly what happened."
I didn't know about the family business for 3 generations. Maybe he's native New Yorker.
Did he know that? No. Maybe he was a native New Yorker, but I don't know. Did Brolin know that for a fact, or was it just something George Lutz told him on the set? Because, as I mentioned in this next graph, Brolin remarks in a making-of feature that George Lutz was, quote, "a good salesman," and that the Lutz children responded to questions about the haunting as though they were reciting a script, rather than recalling real events. The whole Amityville spirit of just lying continued in the film version. After tales of creepy occurrences on the set of The Exorcist and The Omen, part of American International Pictures' press campaign entailed lying about such events that happened on the set of their own film. Refreshingly to the point as always, Margot Kidder would recall in a 2005 interview, "When we did Amityville, the producers told us we should all say these terrible things happened on the set. It was all bullshit. Nothing happened, but it was funny. Brolin did go along to the studio and say that all these terrible things happened, but it wasn't true."
Margot Kidder would later allow that she and James Brolin were not an easy fit during filming. Her looser, more improvisatory approach clashed with his rigorous adherence to the script, and she said, "It's hard to read James Brolin. We didn't get very close. And he's very diplomatic, unlike me." She reminds me of Carrie Fisher. No. Never mind. No, I didn't mean that. "I was very full of myself and thought I was from the hip young Hollywood, and James Brolin to me was from the old stodgy Hollywood." Brolin's comment on that was in fact very diplomatic. He said, "Yeah, there were tribulations."
A solid guy he was.
Margot Kidder also mentioned that Rod Steiger, who played the movie's priest, now Irish, in what you describe as a grievous case of Italian-American erasure, although
yes,
given all the shameful Italian-Americans that popped up in this story, it's probably for the best.
Also true.
"He was really into it," she said. "He was really serious about the story, and every time he talked about it to me, I couldn't help but laugh." This may have been due to Steiger's life at the time. The veteran actor's career was in a low point in the late 70s following an open-heart surgery that left him both depressed and risky for studios to insure. So he came to Amityville with the mindset of, quote, "This is my last maneuver in letting Hollywood know that I'm in good shape physically." He told that to a Wilmington, Delaware newspaper.
Yeah, I went really hard on the local newspapers for this one, too.
In an interview with a Spokane, Washington newspaper in 1979... Jesus, you really did. He described himself as agnostic, but he didn't need any help spiritually or otherwise filming the scene in which the father that he plays is swarmed by flies. It was no effect, he said. "They squirted me all over my face with sugar and beer and then released about 2,000 flies from a screened cage. The worst of it," this is so gross, "was their feet tickling my face and trying not to inhale or swallow any of them." Oh,
Ugh.
well,
I'm surprised I didn't give him another heart attack. Needless to say, the residents of Amityville, who'd been through the ringer twice with the initial murders and then the book, didn't want a film shoot coming in to complete the trifecta. Although supposedly, as I mentioned earlier, the Cromarties were down for it. They simply asked for too much money. Producers Ronald Salland and Elliot Geisinger roamed from Maine to South Carolina until they found a stand-in home in Toms River, New Jersey, and leased the home for $12,000 from the owners. Principal photography started there in the last week of October 1978. Actual author, who's burning in hell, Jay Anson, even called the stand-in, quote, a near-perfect match to the original. This was, of course, after the production did about $30,000 worth of renovations, which basically came down to building a real boathouse, and, of course, the famous windows that lend the Amityville home, or lent, I should say, some owners replaced it, that lent the Amityville home its distinctive jack-o'-lantern appearance. Tom O'Neill, chief of the Toms River Fire Department, told the LA Times that the town raked in an estimated $200,000 from filming, with some of it going to a local forestry student named Thomas Hirschbond, a 22-year-old enlisted to teach James Brolin how to handle an axe. Brolin had confessed to filmmakers that he'd never even held one before, and so young Thomas was dispatched to teach Brolin how to hold an axe properly. After filming exteriors in Toms River, production moved back to Los Angeles to shoot the interiors at MGM Studios, where filming concluded a week ahead of schedule on Soundstage 26 at MGM on December 22nd, 1978. Under 2 months and ahead of schedule, AIP Roger Corman style.
yeah.
The score for the Amityville Horror was by none other than our beloved Lalo Schifrin.
Oh my God! Mission Impossible and
Bullet,
everything.
Cool Hand Luke, Enter the Dragon,
Oh, man.
not The Exorcist, famously,
No, yes.
which explains this next bit. Schifrin, I read interviews with him where he's just blah, 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 like formed the instrumentation and developing the themes, blah, 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 blah. The score is good. It's got a creepy children's choir thing going on, and a lot of dissonant strings, influenced by Polish 20th century composers like Penderecki and Ligeti. One of the most interesting rumors what's more interesting about this to me is that for years it was rumored that Schifrin's rejected score for The Exorcist, which, as you'll remember from our episode on it, Exorcist director William Friedkin rejected figuratively and literally, tossing the reels into a parking lot and calling it f***ing marimba music. Schifrin has denied that he simply took that unused music and ported it over to the Amityville Horror, and you can hear at least 6 minutes of the scotched Exorcist score out there finally, and it doesn't sound anything like the Amityville one, so I believe him. And his score got the film's sole Oscar nomination.
Samuel Arkoff, I would generally assume cigar-chomping studio executive who kicked this whole thing off, crowed to People magazine in 1979, if there were an Academy Award for a publicity campaign, we should get it for this. They'd actually started trying to drum up buzz before filming even began. American International Pictures Creative Affairs VP Charles Glenn, who also oversaw The Godfather's PR Blitz promo, handled a new tie-in cover for another paperback printing and set 8 copywriters to work on the movie campaign slogan. James Brolin and Rod Steiger were joined by the Lutzes on a cross-country tour, along with what People magazine called, quote, a publicity-wise psychic research duo, which one would have to assume is the Warrens.
Who could that be?
Newspaper ads began to appear appropriately on July's Friday the 13th with the winning tagline, "For God's sake, get out." This tagline was so successful that Samuel Arkoff joked people would call theaters and ask for when "For God's sake, get out" was opening. He probably wasn't joking.
Tagline.
I'm sure that was true.
It's a great tagline.
Yeah, it is. When the film was actually released in Finland, it used that phrase for the title, which is good.
So at least one person fell for it.
Yes.
Finland.
James Brolin and Margot Kidder also visited the actual home at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, accompanied by the press. The Amityville Horror premiered at a gala at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City.
Right?
Okay, sure. All right. On July 24th, 1979, to launch a retrospective of 38 American International Pictures films. Okay. The film raked in buckets At the conclusion of its theatrical run, it had grossed a total of $83.4 million in the US and Canada, nearly 20 times its budget of $6 million plus marketing, making it the second highest grossing film of 1979 after Kramer versus Kramer. Like, I can't think of a more diametrically opposed movie to the Amityville Horror than Kramer versus Kramer.
I like to think people did like a Barbenheimer, like the Amityville Kramer, and like just double featured it one day.
Oh, two different kinds of domestic horrors.
Yeah, for a while, this was the most successful independent film of all time. That supplanting Halloween, which had previously come out and earned that. Yeah, and it held on to the record till 1990. When it was supplanted by my beloved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, the leaderboard has been completely screwy. I logged onto a German statistics site called Statista, and they, like a lot of other sources, have The Passion of the Christ as the most successful indie movie of all time. Because you remember Gibson financed that himself. But all of these other lists have all kinds of other qualifiers, like, was the film produced independently but distributed by a major? Then it doesn't count, this or that. By way of example, Statista's number 2 film on this list of most profitable indies of all time is The Graduate, which doesn't even appear anywhere on Wikipedia's top grossing independent list. So I just found that fascinating.
Regardless, in 2019, Forbes published an inflation-adjusted list ranking horror movie film grosses based upon contemporary ticket prices, in which Amityville Horror ranked as the 8th highest grossing horror film of all time, with an adjusted gross of $310.3 million at the time the article came out. Critics, however, were less kind. Roger Ebert dreamed it.
Maybe he did dream it.
Maybe he did dream it.
Maybe we're all just living in Roger Ebert's fever dream about a movie called The Amityville Horror.
He's just looking at a snow globe, thinking about a movie called Amityville Horror that he didn't really like that much.
He didn't like it. But his powerful mind created a multiverse. And we're just living in it. Wake up! Wake up, Ebert! I want out of the Amityville Horror universe. Can you hear me screaming?
Roger Ebert called the Amityville Horror dreary and terminally depressing. People magazine decried it as, quote, ridiculous, and singled out Rod Steiger for overacting. The National Review, famed right-wing news organ...
Muckrakers?
Yeah.
Well, news organ is charitable.
Yeah, called it, quote, dreadful. Just William F. Buckley went to go see the Amityville Horror and was moved to like, all right.
I found this sign-on qua film concerning a popular demonic possession simply unbearable, as anyone with even a passing knowledge of Protestant lore would.
That's very good. That's very good. An impression that 4 of our listeners would get, but I think that is truly incredible. Wow. Janet Maslin went hard at the New York Times, hitting it with, so many horror movie cliches have been assembled under the roof of a single haunted house that the effect is sometimes mind-bogglingly messy. There is apparently very little to which the director, Stuart Rosenberg, will not resort. Oof. But the worst came, or at least the most famous pan, came from... Tell him, Heigl.
Stephen King, our boy Stevie. Yes, that's Stephen King. He panned the film in Rolling Stone in a review of the horror genre in 1979. They must have asked him about like year-end best list. But 2 years later, he returned to it in his 1981 foundational tome on scary stories as a whole called Danse Macabre. He analyzed the film as a meditation on the economic instability of the times, while still allowing that it was stupid and simplistic. Ultimately, he lauded it as a perfect example of the tale to be told around the campfire archetype, comparing it to classic urban legend, the guy with the hook for a hand on the car roof or whatever.
I don't know that urban legend.
Oh, it's like this couple are like necking in a car or whatever, and they keep hearing this scraping sound on the car hood. And or wait, no, maybe I'm thinking of that's the one where the guy hung himself. The woman keeps hearing stuff outside, and the guy's like, "No, baby, this is the '60s. Like, let me make it with you." And, wow, moxie, whatever they said back then, dig it. And, they eventually she like sours the mood, what a killjoy, and drives off. And they find a hook for a hand dangling from the car door handle. And then they read the next day that an escaped mental patient with a hook for a hand had been roaming the very forest where they were necking.
I've never heard that. That's good.
I was getting it conflated with the other one, which is like a similarly like teen necking setup, and then they keep hearing scraping on the roof of their car, and they get creeped out and leave. And it was a guy who hung himself in the tree, his toes scraping the roof.
Wow.
Now, your mileage may vary.
I'm like getting this confused with the opening of Zodiac.
Oh, when the couple just gets bluntly stabbed to death in full view?
I thought shot, but yeah, your mileage may vary.
Anyway, the movie, the original film has received a critical reassessment in recent years, but it certainly never got one from Margot Kidder, who told the AV Club in 2009 that it was a piece of shit. I couldn't believe that anyone would take that seriously. I was laughing my whole way through it, much to the annoyance of Rod Steiger, who took the whole thing very seriously. And then in a barn-burning quote, she says, "It was the crazy Christians who made it a hit. They wanted people to believe in the devil and possessions and haunted houses and all that hooey." Tall, handsome idiot, but nice guy, James Brolin, subsequently blamed the film for a 2-year career slump and said he was typecast. But no one cares.
As a tall, handsome idiot.
Just a benign moron. Since then, Amityville has just become this collective describer for spooky. So it's hard to get an accurate count of quote-unquote true Amityville horror sequels. Because the original was a huge success, that obviously meant that they quickly pumped out, I guess, quote-unquote canonical sequels. 1982's Amityville 2, The Possession, and Amityville 3D, which was apparently followed paranormal investigators as they encountered hauntings at the house. So they'd already even discarded the Lutzes. A made-for-TV fourth film, Amityville 4, The Evil Escapes, was written and directed by the original film screenwriter, the aforementioned Sandor Stern. This came out in 1989, and I am not joking, followed a cursed lamp.
Like a table lamp.
Escaped. Yeah.
So it's
like the Family Guy joke
yeah.
about Stephen King. Yes, exactly that.
Don't forget Amityville, the musical.
No, it's truly wild, man. I mean, so the fact that you can't copyright protect a public place, you can't copyright New York. This means that filmmakers were just free to attach the name of their town to any project about the paranormal.
So funny. That's so funny.
As Amityville became this cultural thing.
I mean, Lutz deserves it. That's such a great
yes, he
loophole.
Absolutely
That's
does.
so great.
It's so turnabout is fair play. So there's films like Amityville Bigfoot and Amityville Shark House. Other notable Amityville films, kitschy or otherwise, include Amityville Vibrator, Amityville Christmas Vacation, Amityville in Space, Amityville Elevator, Amityville Karen, and Amityville Gas Chamber. Jacob Aller, the movie's editor at Paste, told the New York Times in 2024, "If you can't afford an IP, Amityville is just a name you can get for free. Slap anything on the end of it. Just grab a theme out of the ether, and someone will stream it." Iconic horror magazine Fangoria even added a Best Amityville Film category to its Golden Chainsaw Awards last year.
That's hilarious. That's so good.
It is. I mean, it's wild.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is something like, I think that people have estimated between 45 and 54 films as part of the quote-unquote Amityville family of bullshit. There was, of course, also the 2005 Ryan Reynolds starring reboot during the era of Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes, flood of remakes of classic horror films. You may remember he did Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hitcher, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, I think, and the original Nightmare on Elm Street, which are all varying degrees of bad. And at least some of the old AIP razzle-dazzle spirit survived into the aughts. Ryan Reynolds himself claimed in the press that people shooting on set frequently woke up at 3:15 a.m., the spooky time that was supposedly linked to the first killings. Those filmmakers apparently went so far as to credit both George and Kathy Lutz as writers. Although Kathy died the first week of filming, and George, well, he bit the hand that fed him.
Yeah, he hated that movie. He didn't really much like the original one with James Brolin either, but he really didn't like this one.
Yes. The nicest thing that I can say about George Lutz is that he confined his grift to just one story and clung to it like a rat, rather than the Warrens, who spanned their entire brand of lies and abuse over a half-century and an entire country. Lutz otherwise scans largely as a grubby little opportunist who jealously tried to control the one moderately interesting thing he ever did with his entire life. Lutz ultimately, though, embodied the Seinfeld bit about a lie is the truth, if you believe in it enough. By way of example, in 1979, the Washington Post quoted Chris Gugas, a Los Angeles polygraph specialist. He tested the Lutzes separately. An associate worked with Kathy, asking her about the levitation incidents, her whole thing about turning into a 90-year-old woman, etc. Gugas told the paper, they both answered truthfully. They were pretty frightened. And it took us nearly 2 hours to get George calmed down. But what they told us, they believed. Gugas added that he had run similar tests on people in other occult paranormal cases, finding that some were lying outrageously, but that some were telling the truth. This guy is something of a famous polygraph dork. He also lists tests on James Earl Ray and the actress Terry Moore, whom he confirmed in her claim to be Howard Hughes' first wife. Gugas is an ex-CIA guy and wholeheartedly believed in the polygraph, but it is worth noting that the Lutzes contacted him, not the other way around, and given their commitment to the bit, were probably aware of how to manipulate a polygraph test. Gugas estimated in 1979 that across 30,000 tests he'd administered, 70% of people were probably telling the truth. And he said polygraphs were 95 to 97% accurate.
That's not true.
Yes. First of all, polygraph results are not admissible in court. They're simply to help elicit a confession during interrogations. A lengthy article by the American Psychological Association debunks all of this, pointing out largely that all a polygraph does is just measure physiological responses that are subjectively interpreted by the guy running the test. There's a huge set of factors that can affect both the person being tested and the testee. Anyway, speaking of James Earl Ray, your friendly reminder that the FBI killed Martin Luther King.
Yeah, I mean, polygraph tests, they basically just measure skin response and for sweat and heart rate. I mean, so if you put, I think there's like a famous story where if you put like a tack in your shoe or something and they ask the control question at the beginning, which is like, you know, are you in this room right now? Or like something dumber. Did you eat today? Or something like that. If you like prick your toe and cause your heart rate to spike for the control question, then
that's the baseline.
That's the baseline that they go from. So when you lie and your heart rate, you know, kind of imperceptibly goes up when you lie, it'll just seem the same throughout all the rest of the test. It's dumb.
It is dumb. Thank you for saying that, Jordan. Lutz, as I've mentioned so many times, zealously protected his claim. He sued Orion Pictures and Dino De Laurentiis, which, good luck, pal. Talk about a guppy in a shark tank. He sued them in 1989 because he felt the original film's 2 sequels had, quote, so diluted the value of his proposed sequel that his plans to produce it had collapsed. Many of these counts were dismissed, but the original judgment allowed certain aspects of it to continue. Lutz himself said that the De Laurentiis case dragged on 12 years and ended in a settlement. He and Kathy divorced in 1988, and at some point, this, along with the futility of trying to combat the mushrooming Amityville cash-ins, must have sunk in, because he seemed to have stopped trying throughout the 1990s. Or he fell off the grid. I could not find a lot of stuff about him from this time. Maybe he went back to land surveying.
He did do an interview for the 2005 documentary I watched.
Yes. Well, he got back up to things around the turn of the millennia, perhaps motivated by 9/11, you know, which taught us all to just
commit to our bit.
Yeah. So, around the turn of the millennia, Lutz had gotten around to more practical legal measures. He trademarked the Amityville Horror in 2002 with the United States Patent and Trademark Office because he wanted to run a series of quote-unquote nonfiction books about the paranormal. The same year, Lutz signed an agreement with this company called Barstool Productions to allow a sequel to proceed, but it included the provision that the film could not intentionally defame or libel George Lutz. Long story short, the Barstool Productions rights were subsequently transferred to Dimension Films, which were under Miramax, under Disney. Lutz alleges that as much as he tried to get involved with the 2005 remake that came out under Platinum Dooms, itself a subsidiary, blah, 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 that he was shut out. He said he tried to get in contact with anyone, and they kept saying, oh, yeah, we'll bring you in to meet them, or like, we'll send you a free swag bag or a crew jacket or something, but that he was shut out. And this resulted in the Ryan Reynolds starring remake being just balls to the wall more intense than the original. It, of course, starts with the classic, based on a true story, but it also depicts Lutz as killing his dog, building coffins for his wife and kids, choking and later attempting to drown his wife, shooting at his wife and kids, and attacking his son with an axe. This was all a bridge too far for George Lutz, who sued on the basis of defamation. And oh yeah, also on the basis that Dimension hadn't honored his original agreement with Barstool, and he was getting screwed on the money. MGM's countersued, and Lutz died the year after in 2006, so that put an end to that. Lutz's trademark on the Amityville horror phrase lapsed in 2008, and as we will get into, his estate was not interested in continuing this, and so MGM picked it back up in 2023. Lutz's stepkids have since come into the spotlight a little more, and consequently, and unsurprisingly, he looks even worse. Perhaps I should have mentioned that in the interim between Lutz trademarking the phrase Amityville horror and suing over the 2005 remake, he also sued one of his own stepkids. Christopher Quarantino, who changed his name. He ran away from home at 16. He was in the army. This situation really did a number on him, and he did not want to be associated with it. So, in 2003, Quarantino hears that George is planning yet another movie in which the character, quote unquote, of Christopher returns to the original Amityville house, becomes possessed, and kills his father. So Christopher, none too pleased about this, preempted his father by buying the domain amityvillehorror.com.
Petty, but effective.
Yeah, and Lutz countersued for trademark infringement and fraud. Eventually, they settled, and George got the site. What a guy. Quarantino eventually described Lutz more neutrally in the documentary Amityville, an original story, saying Lutz was a man figure that was there and kind to us, and Mom liked him. That was that.
You know, everyone can be a father, but not everyone can be a man figure.
Yeah. So, but both the kids who have come out about this movie maintained an interest. They toe a very interesting line. Christopher maintains that the house was haunted and that George Lutz merely exacerbated conditions by dabbling in the occult and then playing up the results for profit. Christopher called Lutz, quote, a professional showman in an interview with the Seattle Times in 2005 and recalled his stepdad being extremely curious of everything paranormal when they moved in 1975, even trying to summon supernatural beings on his own by chanting. I don't know that I'd call it black magic, but it was a way to call up spirits, Christopher said.
I want a spirit. I want a spirit. I
don't
want
to work anymore. Christopher, again, rebukes a lot of the bullshit in the book, like the ghostly forces that sent the front door to the house flying from its hinges. But he added repeated in interviews that he had personal run-ins with the paranormal in the house. He once saw a presence, quote, as definite as a shadow in the shape of a man that moved towards him and dissipated. The other Amityville kid who's come forward, eldest son Daniel, had an entire movie made about him and his experience, and it is harrowing.
Have you seen
2012's documentary. I've seen in clips. I haven't sat down and watched the whole thing, but it's a rough watch, man. Honestly. This is a 2012 documentary made by an Amityville superfan named Eric Walter. It's called My Amityville Horror. Walter was actually contacted by a friend of Daniel's, who was at the time living in Queens and either working as a UPS driver or a stonemason, according to different sources. Danny's presence in the film is disturbing. He's chain-smoking, becomes quite literally furious at anything George Lutz was involved in. And just he's a generally haunted mien, I'll say. But he also said that paranormal experience happened in the house. Whispering voices, moving furniture. But more pertinently, he describes George Lutz as a vain, controlling man who kept his family on a tight leash. He claims Lutz was abusive, both verbally and physically. IndieWire, in the review, wrote, Daniel's stories seem less like tales of supernatural terror and more like the coping mechanism of a young boy who has been sexually assaulted by a parental figure. So I couldn't find anything else about sexual abuse specifically. But between Christopher and Daniel, both having these definite, quote unquote, definite memories of the paranormal, but also both hating their dad, it stands to reason that this entire thing was something that he just berated them into believing, which is horrifying. There was a psychiatrist in the film who was later quoted as saying, this is reminiscent of cases of sexual abuse in which because kids of a young age are malleable. And if you get at them from a certain angle with repetition or abuse or physical or verbal abuse, they will believe something that's been planted into them for the rest of their life. And that's why I have it out for old Georgie, man. Like the fact that you had these young kids who were not yours so fervently believing in the paranormal while also hating your guts for whatever you did to them. That is a crime beyond the pale.
Well, the only way we can really get out of this really sad, horrific, depressing anecdote is
real estate.
Historic real estate and architecture. We're going to talk about the true star of this episode, the Amityville Horror House. The 1927 Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue. 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom, gets great light, oceanfront. Look at that. What a great place. In a 2000 interview with the History Channel, Kathy Lutz claimed that a tragedy befell every family that ever lived in the house, which is another complete lie. Jay Anson's book suggests that the property is cursed because it had once belonged to John Ketchum, a suspected witch who had fled Salem, Massachusetts before taking up residence in Amityville. Not true.
Unsurprisingly.
Yes. James Cromartie, who bought the house with his wife after the Lutzes, said in an August 1979 press conference, "I was born in Amityville. I knew every family that grew up in this house. The Lutzes say that every family that was brought up in this house had bad things happen to them. It happens to be a fact that only one family had a tragedy happen to them in that house." The Cromarties remained in the house without anything especially evil happening until 1987, when it was purchased by Gene and Peter O'Neill. This is unforgivable as far as I'm concerned. They changed the famed eye windows to square ones, I guess to attract fewer onlookers, and filled in the DeFeo's pool. Almost 10 years later, on June 10th, 1997, Brian Wilson, no, not that one, purchased the house for approximately $310,000. He remained there for 13 years, putting the house up for sale in 2010 for $1.15 million. It didn't sell for that, though. It was purchased for $910,000 by Caroline D'Antonio and her husband David, who lived there until 2016 when it went on the market again, listed for $850,000. It again didn't make market price and was eventually sold in March 2017 for $605,000, which, I don't know, man, for oceanfront in Long Island, that's a bargain.
That's a bargain, yeah, right?
Take us home.
We joke here on TMI. Jordan, would you agree?
I think we do, yeah.
We joke. But remember, at the heart of this, 6 people were shot in their beds at night. To that end, the Amityville saga is a truly American one. Rich kids offing their parents for money, grubby opportunists coming in and peddling lies to profit from a genuine tragedy. Hollywood, a succession of lawsuits. But the most resonance that I find with it at this point is the constant churn of these new low-rent films that are just tagged with the Amityville name. 4 of them came out this year alone.
Wow.
And researching the varying lists of them that have been compiled online starts to resemble the infinite scroll experience of social media. That's the most American thing about it. Tragedy becomes farce, becomes just content. An entire cottage industry of low-effort nonsense built on a lie started by a couple of carnival barkers. What's more haunting than that? I'm Alex Heigl. This has been Too Much Information.
I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time. Too Much Information was a production of iHeart Radio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The show's supervising producer is Michael Alder June.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl,
with original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeart Radio, visit the iHeart Radio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.